The sunrise spilled molten gold across the valley as I stepped out onto the porch of my ranch, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that settled into your bones and reminded you why you left the city behind. In the first place, the barn, old but sturdy, stood like a sentinel against the backdrop of rolling green. It was a symbol of everything I had built with my own hands, every post hammered in, every beam lifted, every memory stored within its weathered walls. That tranquility shattered on a Tuesday morning. I was in town picking up supplies when I got a call from my neighbor Hank. "You might want to get back here," he said, his voice tight. "There's a construction crew out by your barn and they're not from around here." It drove like hell. When I crested the final hill leading to my property, I nearly drove off the road at the sight. My barn was half collapsed, mangled under the jaws of an excavator. Dust and wood splinters filled the air, slammed the brakes and jumped out, heart pounding, fists clenched. A man in a neon vest and a clipboard walked over like he owned the place. "This property is under HOA redevelopment," he said, handing me a flimsy piece of paper. "We have authorization to clear this space for the upcoming lake access path and community viewing deck." I stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. "You demolished my barn on my land and you think that's okay?" "You should have received a notice," he replied, not looking me in the eye. "Check with your HOA." "What notice?" "Hadn't gotten a damn thing." I marched back to my truck and tore through my files. No letters, no emails, no calls, nothing. Back in town, I stormed into the HOA office. Receptionist gave me that fake, polite smile that said she knew something I didn't. "Karen will see you now. She'll see HIRPED. Of course it was her. President Karen Simmons. Short, sharp hair, power blazer, attitude like she ran a Fortune 500 company instead of a suburban neighborhood. She greeted me with mock surprise. "We assumed you'd been informed," she said sweetly. "Your barn was technically outside the setback lines and zoned within the HOA's jurisdiction for environmental beautification projects." I felt the heat rise in my chest. "That barn was on land my family's owned for 60 years. Your jurisdiction ends at the road." Karen just shrugged. "Well, zoning maps change." Mitchell, my lawyer, got involved that afternoon. He reviewed every deed, every plat, every zoning change filed in the last year. What we found blew the lid off everything. Turns out the HOA had secretly filed for a zone expansion, subtly redrawing boundaries to include parts of my property without any direct notification to me. The barn and the surrounding few acres had been declared part of a green initiative zone. Karen had used a loophole to get around state laws requiring landowner notification. She published the zoning change in a classified ad in a newspaper 2 counties over. Mitchell was furious. "This isn't just illegal. It's vindictive." I didn't just want restitution. I wanted consequences. But first, I wanted a little taste of revenge. I hiked up into the hills the next morning with a set of old blueprints. They belonged to my grandfather, who had engineered the valley's original irrigation system decades ago. It was a system of controlled flow dams, sluice gates, and underground aquifers. In one of those gates, the one just upstream of the new HOA lake, was on my land. With a little help from a backhoe and a welder friend, I sealed the dam's release valve. Slowly, methodically, the water that fed the man-made lake began to recede. By the next week, boat docks sat in mud. Fish flopped helplessly. HOA residents began complaining about the smell. Karen called an emergency meeting. "We're investigating the water issue," she announced, pretending not to know the cause. "There may be upstream interference." The moment came when one of the residents, a retired engineer, pulled out a map. "The main feeder stream originates here," he said, pointing to my property. "Did anyone clear this with the landowner?" Karen's face paled. She turned toward me. I stepped forward, pulling out a large laminated deed. "This stream, this valve, and that entire feeder system is on private land. Mine. And since you demolished my barn without due process, I exercised my right to suspend easement privileges." Chaos erupted. Residents demanded refunds for boat rentals, HOA fees, and recreational permits. Karen tried to regain control, but the damage was done. Mitchell filed a formal complaint with the county zoning board. The hearing was scheduled. Media caught wind. A local news van showed up at my ranch. The headline that evening read, "Rancher turns off tap. HOA lake dries up." It was beautiful. At the hearing, I presented every scrap of evidence. Zoning maps, timelines, witness accounts. Karen's entire scheme unraveled. The board ruled in my favor. The HOA was fined, Karen was removed. And I was awarded damages for the barn and emotional distress. But I didn't rebuild the barn. Instead, I cleared the space and erected a memorial bench overlooking the now empty lake bed. Plaque read, "Here stood a barn built by hands of grit and heart until paper pushers thought they owned the land. Now every time I sip my coffee and watch the sunrise over that empty lake, I remember one thing. Boundaries matter. And if you don't respect mine, don't be surprised when I turn off the flow." Word spread quickly. Ranchers from nearby counties stopped by to shake my hand. I got calls from people dealing with their own HOA nightmares. One man from Idaho offered to write an article about the situation for a rural landowners magazine. I agreed, and soon. My mailbox was flooded with letters from people who said my story gave them hope. But Karen wasn't done. She filed a countersuit, claiming emotional distress and economic sabotage. Mitchell laughed her out of court with a 5-inch binder of evidence. We didn't just win again, we dismantled the last threads of her influence. The judge even added a personal note. The defendant acted within his rights and protected his land from unlawful encroachment. The developer who had partnered with Karen also faced backlash. His real estate company had hoped to turn the lake into a luxury recreational retreat. Without water, without permits, and now under legal scrutiny, his investors bailed. Last I heard, he was trying to sell the rights to a dried-up lake. Meanwhile, I expanded my ranch. Bought 2 adjacent parcels and built a new barn, twice as large, solar-powered, and entirely off-grid. I named it Phoenix Shed. In honor of what was lost and what rose in its place, local schools began sending kids for field trips, learning about sustainable water management and private property rights. One group even made a class project about my barn story. The presentation won a state competition. As spring arrived, the wildflowers returned to the dried lake bed, its nature reclaiming what had been wrongly taken. I let it grow wild. What once was a HOA vanity project had become a sanctuary. That was the best revenge of all, thriving, and it didn't stop there. The empty lake bed eventually became a nesting ground for a protected species of heron. Environmentalists rallied around the site, and I filed to have it protected under a state conservation order. The once recreational space turned into a wildlife refuge. That meant no construction, no landscaping, and no interference. Karen's dream of lakefront. Condos vanished under federal protection. Tourists came to visit the herons. Local artists painted the transformation. A documentary team interviewed me and even aired a segment on public television about standing up to unjust development. One evening, a young man visited me, turns out. He was the grandson of the original surveyor who had plotted this land decades ago. He brought old maps, more accurate than anything the HOA had ever seen. We spent hours cross-referencing landmarks and features. Those maps became instrumental in a historical preservation effort I submitted to the county. That effort succeeded. The entire area was granted heritage status. HOA members could no longer legally alter the terrain without approval from a preservation board. That board, by the way, had me on its advisory committee. I'd gone from being a rancher to a steward of land, history, and resilience. Karen faded from memory, her arrogance outmatched by sheer persistence. My story had grown beyond petty revenge, became a blueprint for others, and every time someone tried to fight me again, simply pointed to the lake bed, to the herons, to the generations of care in every acre. This is mine, I'd say. And it's staying that way. The weeks that followed were calm, but I knew better than to let my guard down. Karen might have been disgraced, and the HOA licking its wounds, but bureaucracy has a long memory and deeper pockets than most people realize. I kept meticulous. Records of everything: water table reports, legal filings, visitor logs at the wildlife refuge. If they were going to come back, they'd find a wall of evidence waiting. It was a Thursday morning when I received an official-looking envelope. In the mail, this time, the HOA wasn't acting alone. A developer, Bright Ridge Properties, had submitted a proposal to the county to redivert the water flow, this time from a different upstream tributary. The plan was slick: reclassify the land just above the conservation boundary, install a temporary pumping station, and refill the lake without touching the protected valve on my land. Legally, it was a clever workaround. Ethically, it was an insult. I drove straight to the county planning office, where I waded through 2 hours of procedural nonsense before sitting down with the water rights coordinator. I laid out my documents, my deeds, my easements. I pointed to the clause that said any water flow diversion impacting existing natural habitats required landowner consent. They didn't have mine. The clerk, a man named Daryl with a comb-over and a nervous cough, thumbed through the proposal, frowned, and promised to escalate the issue. I wasn't reassured, so I took a different route. That evening, I invited a local news crew back to the ranch, the same one who'd covered the dried lake bed. I gave them a walking tour of the heron nests, the regrown wildflowers, and the impact of the conservation designation. The footage aired that night with the headline, "Developers aim to drain refuge for resort dreams." Public outcry was swift. Within days, an online petition to block Bright Ridge's proposal had over 50,000 signatures. Environmental groups joined in. Local politicians, smelling an election opportunity, came out against the plan. Karen, surprisingly, tried to stay quiet. But someone leaked her emails correspondence with Bright Ridge execs promising access and zoning support. It wasn't long before she became a symbol of everything wrong with unchecked HOA power. But the real twist came when I received an unexpected visitor. It's a man named Elias Carter, elderly, dressed in denim and flannel, with weathered hands and sharp eyes. He introduced himself as the son of the original rancher who'd sold part of the valley back in the 60s. "You're doing what my father never could," he said, handing me a dusty leather folder. Inside were land surveys, handwritten notes, and something else: water usage agreements dated before the dam system was even constructed. Agreements that predated the county's entire water charter. With Mitchell's help, we had the documents authenticated. They showed unequivocally that not only did my family have primary rights to the water system, but those rights were grandfathered beyond most state oversight. Conservation designation, the environmental groups, the legal victories, all of it suddenly had a deeper foundation. We filed a formal injunction. Bright Ridge had to pull their proposal. They issued a public statement blaming administrative confusion and unforeseen legal complications. Behind the scenes, their investors panicked. 2 board members resigned. I was asked to speak at a state landowners summit. My topic, defending rural rights against urban expansion. The auditorium was packed. Ranchers, farmers, environmentalists, even a few disgruntled ex-HOA members came to hear my story. I spoke from the heart. But I brought receipts, slides, maps, video. It wasn't just about my barn anymore. It was about land, legacy, and standing your ground when the odds are stacked. Karen eventually moved out of the neighborhood, sold her home at a loss. I heard she tried to start a consultancy business for HOA conflict resolution. It tanked. Back at the ranch, life found a new rhythm. I opened a small visitor center for the wildlife refuge. School buses lined the dirt road every other Friday. Kids learned about biodiversity, water management, and the power of one person to protect something sacred. I even hired a part-time go-to-college student studying environmental law. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from Daryl at the county office. "Just thought you should know," he said. "The board voted to make your valley a case study for future zoning integrity reviews. That meant no future developer could sneak in rezoning again, not without a full audit and landowner consent." Was the final lock on a door I hoped would never reopen. In time, the scars of the barn's destruction faded. Trees grew where its shadow once fell. The bench overlooking the lake bed remained. though now it looked out over something more peace, purpose, protection. A symbol, not of loss, but of resilience. And when the wind blew just right through the reeds, and the birds called to one another across the water-starved basin, swore I could hear my grandfather's voice in the breeze. Never let them take. What's yours without a fight? Not only had I honored that legacy, I'd secured it for generations to come. More recognition came than I had anticipated. The local historical society named me Land Steward of the Year. They awarded me a plaque and requested archival footage and blueprints of the irrigation system. I handed over the documents Elias gave me, assuring the story would be preserved. One weekend, a regional university contacted me, proposing to partner in a long-term environmental research project on my land. They'd set up equipment to monitor the effects of invasive development on semi-arid ecosystems. I agreed with one condition. The final data would remain public. That transparency paid off, especially when neighboring communities used the findings to reject their own encroaching development plans. My land became a teaching ground, not just for school kids, but for graduate students, researchers, and even policymakers. I had to build a second trail through the refuge, one that wound past the dam valve and up toward the crest of the hill. There, an observation deck gave visitors a panoramic view of what had once been a battleground and had now become a beacon. Filmmaker approached me next. He wanted to turn the whole saga into a docuseries. I was hesitant at first. Fame wasn't what I was chasing, but when he showed me a rough cut, I changed my mind. It aired on a national streaming platform. The title, The Man Who Turned Off the Lake. Messages poured in. Emails, handwritten letters, even gifts. One package held a hand-carved wooden model of a barn, sent by a retired carpenter in Ohio, who said he'd faced a similar struggle. I couldn't save mine, he wrote, but you gave me peace. One evening, while clearing weeds near the property line, I found an old horseshoe buried in the soil, likely from my grandfather's time. I mounted it on the bench near the lake bed. A reminder that the past never truly disappears, just waits to be honored. Bright Ridge. Now, a cautionary tale in business circles quietly dissolved their HOA-focused subdivision projects. Their CEO resigned. Their headquarters was absorbed by another firm, and their last public statement about the valley simply said, "We underestimated local resistance." I wasn't just resistance. I was legacy and grit, and the culmination of everything they thought could be paved over with enough permits. So as the seasons cycled forward, as herons nested and children laughed and the wind whispered through the reeds, I found peace. It's not the kind that forgets, but the kind that remembers and builds something better in its wake.